Hello and good evening. I'm sorry we had to close the nice view, but apparently you wouldn't be able to see us otherwise. I've been told I have to take care of the most important business first off, which is the bar will be shut during our presentation. So please, if you'd like to get a drink, get it now and bring it to your seat. And then it'll open again at the end. We're not going to do Q&A with the audience, but everybody's going to stay afterwards. So if you do have questions, please keep them till after, and then you can mingle with the guests. My name is Shephard. I'm a journalist and filmmaker for about, thank you. About 21 years I was with the Toronto Star, and the last part of that time I did a lot of work in the field. I was foreign correspondent in a job that unfortunately we don't have a lot of anymore in Canada, so I was very lucky, and now I'm independent. And it is my great honor to be here tonight to help moderate this discussion with these incredible women who do not need an introduction, but I will introduce them. Carol Off is award-winning journalist, author, filmmaker, professor now. 16 years as the voice of As It Happens. I still listen to her Conrad Black interview every once in a while just to be inspired. I think it's actually taught in journalism schools. She was a foreign correspondent with The National. She has written multiple books and has one coming out September 2nd, is it? Mm-hmm. Which I'm very excited about and I think is going to help inform our discussion in part tonight. And it's called At a Loss for Words, Conversation in an Age of Rage. She has also spent all day today, and I think the greater part of the week, reading her book for an audiobook. So she might drift off on us at some point. We'll just kick her there. And she is a co-president with me with the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. So welcome, Carol. And Dr. Samantha Nutt is one of those women, when you're reading her bio, you're like, oh, come on. She is the founder, executive director of War Child. She is an Order of Canada recipient. She's a fierce advocate for human rights here in Canada. And the number of countries where she has worked in the field are astounding. Just to name a few, Darfur, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, the list goes on. She has honorary doctorates from all over North America, and she's a lovely person. They both are, and that right now I say that. But yeah, that's a remarkable thing, and I think the best part of your biographies with what you've seen. You've seen some of the worst of humanity, and you've kept your humanity.
I agree.
We're going to start with. Okay, thank you very much for coming. That was great. We're gonna start tonight with Sam. If you can explain, just tell us a little bit about War Child Canada and the work you do.
Absolutely. So War Child is an international humanitarian organization, and oh, I'm getting some feedback here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And so we focus on long-term solutions to help children and their families recover from the trauma of war and rebuild their communities. And part of the way that we do that is that we take a long-term view of some of the challenges that kids are facing. So we focus on some of those big deficits that accrue as a result of chronic conflict, deficits in the area of education, ability to mobilize and support and strengthen the rights, particularly of women and girls. We do a lot of work around economic development and food security so that families actually can begin to recover, begin to rebuild, but that are also then in charge of that process of recovery in a way that is much more sustainable. And to do that, we work exclusively with local staff and local partners. So we have about 900 staff throughout the world right now. More than 99% of them, 99.9%, are from war zones. They are leading the charge. They are the champions of change within their communities, which is really inspiring to bear witness to. And I would say, fortunately, but also unfortunately, we're working with about 1.2 million children and their families right now every year, which, given what's going on in the world, which I know we'll be talking about a bit later, it seems like a big number, but the demand for our services has never been more intense and more necessary than it has been, certainly since I've been doing this work, and I've been doing it for 30 years. I started in Somalia during the famine with the United Nations, and we're in a very difficult period of human history. So that's what War Child does. We have a small team here in Toronto of about 23 people, and again, most of our efforts are overseas with our national staff and national partners who are doing great work.
And maybe just quickly tell us the genesis of it, how it came to be.
Well, you know, I started off because I'm a medical doctor working with the UN in Somalia, as I mentioned, during the famine, and worked with other NGOs, academic groups, United Nations organizations off and on for about 5 years in different war zones after that. And one of the things that we really began to take notice of, and I'm a public health doctor, so I'm very much interested in how do you prevent some of these terrible outcomes from taking place? How do you really ensure that people have the opportunity to protect themselves, to provide for themselves, and to sustain their health over the long term? And one of the things that was very obvious and very frustrating was that the vast majority of international humanitarian aid focused on short-term solutions, so the business of keeping people alive, food, water, shelter, blankets. It was heavily dependent on external expertise, this big infrastructure staff, mostly by foreigners, who would fly into a crisis, set up these parallel structures, and then when the next crisis hit, they would pack up and move on. And by way of example, when I landed in Somalia, it was right on the heels of the Rwandan genocide. And Somalia went from having about 140 international NGOs that were responsible for the entire health and social welfare infrastructure because it was a failed state in the midst of this famine. And then within 6 months of the Rwandan genocide, there were fewer than 40 international aid organizations remaining. And we saw a second wave of famine that was taking place, people dying of preventable diseases such as cholera. I mean, all of those services were driven to a halt. And as a result of seeing that over and over and over and over again, and seeing this tremendous amount of money that was being spent on bringing in foreigners to take over the work, to subsume those jobs, and not leaving that capacity behind or those local investments and not creating those local jobs either, started to think about, well, there has to be a different model. There has to be this bridge between emergency crisis assistance and international development that takes place when you've got a reasonable amount of stability. And that became looking at some of those models, and that became the genesis of War Child in '99. So this is our 25th year anniversary, which is terrific. Yeah. It's also a sign of my advancing age, but other than that.
We were just talking about menopause and hormone replacement therapy in the green room before
it's
this.
Like, I'll call in a prescription for you right now.
Do you want us to change the discussion now and start talking about that?
That'll be the discussion at the bar later. Carol, can you do the same and explain for us what CJFE, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, is?
Can I just note, though, I'm hearing music.
I told you she was reading all day.
I know. It's like, but I know we are recording this, and so that might.
Do you smell burnt toast?
All right, okay. Woo-hoo. Anyway, CJFE, yes, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. We are co-presidents of that organization, and we are 40 years old, and so it is the oldest organization of its kind in Canada. And it was started to advocate on behalf of Canadian issues, right? So that was the big part of it. It wasn't international at the beginning. And the idea was that we wanted better access to information. We wanted to advocate on behalf of free speech and the necessity of opening up files and getting the police out of our way and being able to get into courts and be able to report on things and get rid of injunctions against reporting. So that's how it began for a long time. And it's now increasingly more international for obvious reasons. And what CJFE, how it's different, because there are many organizations with, I'm sure you found out when you try to research this, that there's this alphabet soup of organizations. So there's Canadian Journalist Foundation, there's the Canadian Journalists for Human Rights, and then there's the EIEIO. And so anyway, we always get kind of confused, but Canadian Journalists for Free Expression is it's the only advocacy group. And it makes it more difficult to raise money and all these things because it's very political. It's a questioning of, why are you doing this? Why are you not allowing journalists to go in here? Why are you killing journalists? Why are you arresting journalists? and standing up for their rights and standing up for general free expression and in general journalism, but also specifically for individuals who need our help. One of the most interesting programs we have is actually run by Michelle, and it's Journalists in Distress. It's called the JID Fund. And this is, it will break your heart. I don't know how Michelle does it, because she gets these constant barrage of people from journalists around the world. You can't believe how many journalists are out there doing the most important work, and no one knows anything about what they're. She had a group of them. I was reviewing some of the latest people who got grants from this JID program, and there was this fellow who was in Nigeria. He was investigating these henchmen, these herdsmen, I guess, came into the village and slaughtered the people in the village because they wanted the land. It's always a fight over resources. And he covered the story. He went in and interviewed everybody and did the story locally, and then had to flee for his life. And so Michelle, through a network of people she's involved with, found out about this guy, and that helping him to get out of the country, helping him to go underground. Another journalist who was a Ukrainian who was arrested by the Russians, the FSB, who tortured him, extracted a false confession, and he's in prison. And Michelle was giving him a grant in order to help support his wife and also to pay some legal bills to see if we can get him out of prison. To journalists, filmmakers in Sudan who were able to capture the war crimes on tape. They actually got this evidence, but it was part of their research. And they realized they had to get out of town really fast. And so this grant that CJFE was able to provide allowed them to get into Ethiopia. And so these things are now increasingly, we're advocating on behalf of these individuals, and not just helping them, giving them the money, but then saying, you cannot do this. And contacted governments and making public statements. Because a lot of times, I think you probably know, Sam, that a lot of NGOs don't say anything politically. And I totally understand that. They'll go in, they'll do the job, they'll protect somebody, they'll help somebody, they'll relieve them. But they're not going to say, why are you doing this? Who did this? Who killed this guy? Who put that landmine there? And that's when you get into advocacy. You start to do that kind of work where you say, yes, I will help you, I'll give you that grant, but we are going to make it public that this should not be happening to you. And so that's the role CJFE plays among that great big alphabet soup of organizations in this country.
It is humbling sometimes when we call ourselves all journalists, and you hear what some of the journalists go through, and you think we're not in the same league. And we will get to that later on in the discussion, because talking about how the face of journalism and NGOs are changing in some ways, and more empowerment of local journalists. Before we get there, and you've kind of just touched on it in terms of all the harrowing stories of what journalists are facing, Sam, maybe you can give us a sense of this is a huge question, but where we are in terms of the world's crisis. I mean, I'm sure you get this all the time. I'm sure everybody here gets this or has felt it themselves, where it just feels like too much. You know, we had Ukraine, there's Gaza, Sudan, and there's a whole bunch of conflicts we don't even talk about. It feels overwhelming. It feels like we're in a really dire point of history. Are we?
I think there's no denying that we're in a very unstable period of human history. And I think that if you look at the trends, particularly over the last decade, but even if you look over the last 2 decades, the numbers are quite staggering. I mean, we're facing the worst refugee and displacement crisis since World War II, with more than 117 million people displaced. Sudan alone, where War Child had operations in Darfur for more than 20 years, we're one of the only Canadian organizations directly implementing in Darfur. You know, that crisis has, again, contributed more than 10 million internally displaced people, tens of thousands of people who've been killed. And again, that's not a crisis that we're even registering. We're talking a lot about Gaza and Israel and Ukraine, but as a result of the intense conversations and focus on those particular crises in the last couple of years, we have overlooked some incredibly acute and pressing needs in other parts of the world, including, I'm just back from Afghanistan about 10 days ago, where the situation for women and girls is quite dire, and yet the opportunity to be able to continue operating and providing support in a country that is frankly one of the highest risks of famine in the world, where 2/3 of the population is dependent on international humanitarian assistance. Same with Yemen, where War Child's operating, where I've been 3 times in the last 14 months trying to augment and improve our capacity to deliver programming there. I mean, we're also facing one of the worst food insecurity crises, with about 50 million people at risk of starvation. And those are actually crises that it is entirely within our capacity as compassionate human beings, international governments, through our foreign aid, through private philanthropy and in other means, to be able to respond to some of these developments and provide support for those who desperately need it. But because we have been we either feel very cynical, or because we're singularly focused on these other crises, which have taken the lion's share of resources, these other crises, people are suffering entirely unnecessarily, where things could be done. I mean, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Sudan, if you look at Afghanistan, I mean, last year, 2023, the global humanitarian appeals ended at less than 35% funded for each of those crises. And this year, for example, I mean, I think Yemen's about 3.5%, Afghanistan is about the same. And what you're seeing is things like World Food Program saying, I'm sorry, we can't run food distributions anymore. And so when you're on the front lines of that, and World Food Program, we're one of their partners in different contexts throughout the world, you see families that are being driven to make very, very desperate choices, which is exacerbating the problem. So are we in a difficult place? Yes. Is it getting worse? Yes. Does it need to get worse? No. Then the question becomes, how should we be responding as an international community, as people who believe in compassion and empathy and support that extends locally as well as internationally? What do we do about it? And unfortunately, we're not making the right investments at the right time, which will see a knock-on effect over the next few years.
Have you experienced a little bit, either in the field or back here when you're fundraising or just doing the work you do, that there is a bit of a compassion fatigue, that people do get to the point, I mean, that's a very negative question, but I mean, you do start to see that a little bit, that it's too much?
I mean, I don't believe in compassion fatigue. I believe that we have a can't walk and chew gum problem. Right. You know, in the sense that so all of a sudden everybody's focused on Ukraine, and we're inundated. And I think this is, to you know, in terms of your experience, both of you, I mean, this is where the media has an incredibly important responsibility. And the media have been disproportionately focused on Ukraine and then Israel and then Gaza, often at the expense of other crises. I mean, if you think about Sudan, last April, when that crisis hit, and we still have 90% of the population that is completely inaccessible from a humanitarian aid perspective. The coverage that dominated in Canada in particular was all about getting the foreigners out. And that, to me, is where we need to do, I think, and the media are part of this, aid organizations are part of this, we need to do a better job of communicating some of those stories and drawing people's attention or driving interest in other parts of the world and some of these challenges. Because the biggest thing that we get, that I confront, and again, I've been in a lot of war zones in the last couple of years and in my lifetime, but the biggest thing that I hear over and over and over again is, why is our suffering not enough? Why is there so much money for all of these other places, and here, you know, our food distributions have been cut back by 70%, and our babies are dying in front of us? And I don't have a good answer for that.
Carol, provide the answer for that. It does segue to the next question, though, in terms of where we are in the state of media, because we talk about this a lot as journalism in crisis right now, in terms of cutbacks, this lack of trust in media, the clawing back of free speech. Where do you think we're at right now?
Well, in the same way that the compassion fatigue, you don't believe that exists, and I think there's the trust deficit is the term that gets used now with journalism. And we saw during with Donald Trump as early as in 2016 his assault on the media, and as we know, it's very important if you want to have an autocracy, if you want to dismantle democracy, if you want to be a dictator, the first thing you got to do is get rid of the journalists, right? Because you can't have anybody independently reporting on things. And so we watched really early on Trump, and who has accelerated this and will make it even more extreme should he become the president again, is this assault on free speech and this assault on the fake media and this attack on trying to denigrate and trying to separate people's faith and trust in the media. And so during the first 18 months of Donald Trump's presidency, I believe it was something that New York Times did an estimate of. There were, I think, 50 or 60 different new laws passed around the world to deal with fake news. So every other country was picking up on this language. I said, great. I mean, if they're the leader of the free world and they're crushing their journalists, well, this is our moment. And they all began to, some of them already had the most horrendous laws against the free press to begin with, but they took advantage of this moment to separate people, to say there's fake news, there's all this fake news, you have to deal. So now this fake news thing is in every language. It's an epidemic, this idea that somehow you can't trust the media. And that's what populists have to do. That's what wannabe autocrats have to do. They have to separate you, the public, from independent sources of knowledge, because they can't get anywhere if you're going to be able to question, or anyone's going to question what they're doing. And so we've seen this increasingly happen. And so at the same time, when social media is undermining in a different way, because social media is wanting to get all the attention, they make a lot of money by attracting people away from mainstream media and being able to make aggregations and to give you what you want and take you deeper and deeper into conflict and angry places, because emotions keep you online longer, keep your eyeballs on their page, they make more money. So there's all these things assaulting the business. We're losing revenue, newspapers are shutting down in Canada. It's incredible if you actually look at the numbers of newspapers and news organizations, radio stations that have shut down just in the past couple of years. And they're shutting down because they don't have advertising, they don't have support, because social media is just siphoning that off. So it's attacking us in every direction, and I despair for how people can get independent information. But I think that just in trying to get the message out there, trying to reconnect people, not just with journalism, but with all of our institutions, because you start with the journalists, but then you start withering, the school system is something. Don't trust the schools. Don't trust the teachers. Oh, librarians, they're pedophiles. I mean, there's you get all this. You're being constant this barrage, very deep in the United States, where they're actually just dismantling one pillar of civil society after another. And it's being very effective. And so I think that there has to be a resistance to that. And I think increasingly people are saying, wait a second here. I don't want to give up what we've got. I like this country. I don't want to buy into this idea that this country's broken. And that's what people are getting, because that's what you're being told. And so I don't know if we can recover from this, but I think people want information. They want independent information. And so I think it's that desire to actually see us recover. There's so many small organizations online, especially now. We have so many really interesting little they're struggling desperately. Buy subscriptions. I know. It's like you want to say, I don't know, I can't get past this paywall. Well, don't, pay and buy the subscription. And support your media, So so that's the state we're in, as you know very well.
Yeah, and to Sam's question, what do you think about what conflicts get covered, what don't? I mean, that's kind of been an age-old question, really, but it does seem worse today that, things are getting completely ignored. Is that just an issue of resources?
I think it's collectivism. I mean, it's like people, the news, because the social media is drawing the eyeballs in with whatever it's a rage farm, and it's eye candy or whatever it is that they're attracting the viewer or reader away from. Then the mainstream media has to try and compete with that, and so they do the same thing. You mentioned that that there's all this attention being given to Ukraine or to Gaza when no one's looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, and we can't walk and chew gum, so you can't care about Afghanistan and Gaza at the same time. You can't follow Ukraine and Sudan. I think it's even worse than that, to tell you the truth, because when I was watching this past week, when Netanyahu was making the plans, when the IDF made its plans to go into Rafah to actually do the assault we saw going on last week. And I thought, how clever is this? Because all of the media was talking about the conviction of Donald Trump. There was nothing. I'm opening my paid-for websites and seeing all the top stories. I'm looking down. Rafah is at the bottom. So it's not even. It's like you can't even compete on that level, right? Because all the oxygen is being sucked out of the room by following whatever happens to that guy. And so you have to compete for all of this attention. So I think it's even, it's this, social media has a huge responsibility for this, but I think people are starting to want to know more. They sense there's something, right? Am I wrong? People, you sense that you're not getting the news, right?
I feel like every one of my questions here is like an hour conversation unto itself, so I'm sort of jumping around a little bit, but I do want to talk about something that I think both affects journalism and definitely aid, which is the weaponization of it. And I know naively, I think I only came to this back in 2011. We were talking about this earlier when I was covering a famine in Somalia, and we did a series for the Star called Somalia When Famine is a Crime. And it was because the US had security laws that would not allow aid to go into areas that al-Shabaab controlled. But they controlled the good majority of the country at that time, and it completely made the famine tenfold worse, 100-fold worse. That was an early example of that. We're definitely seeing that more and more. The question to both of you, really, how is the press, it's not so much weaponized, but as you said earlier, being shut down to control a conflict, or how are you seeing it as a weapon of a conflict?
Do you want me to go?
Just that little question.
That's a big one. Look, all aid is inherently political. Who gets support, why they get support, under what circumstances they get support. All of those become political questions, even down to, and again, there's been tremendous need to invest in the humanitarian response in Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere. But if you look at the disproportionate amount of resources, even from governments, that have gone into providing that level of support to those crises and not, again, to Sudan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, I mean, those are political calculations, right? So you can never really fully divorce, unfortunately, aid from the political questions that surround it. So that's an inherent sort of part of aid. What I will say, though, is that we have witnessed a dramatic, I wouldn't even say, I would have called it, 5 years ago, I would have called it an erosion of the humanitarian space. Now what I will call it is a full assault on the humanitarian space. It really, I mean, I won't get into the sort of details as to why, but we really did start to see the decline of this idea of a neutral humanitarian zone with Somalia, with the weaponization of aid in the famine response, and the fact that there were military forces in the early 90s who were then on the front lines of delivering aid, created this perception that aid was just an extension of Western hegemony, and it was just this, extension of the military arm of the West and their political agenda. And then we saw that again in Kosovo. We definitely saw that in Iraq. We saw it in Afghanistan. Every time military forces are out there rebuilding schools or providing aid or building hospitals. It's as part of the hearts and minds strategy. It works for the militaries, but it does, unfortunately, erode that neutral humanitarian space and create increased risks for humanitarian actors. In the last few years, particularly with Syria, where you had Russia that had, I think they bombed 4 hospitals, a couple of them run by MSF. In 2015, the Americans accidentally bombed Kunduz Hospital, which killed 40 people. Then you're seeing with Gaza this fact that it should be possible, and both sides, the IDF and Hamas, it should be possible to deliver humanitarian aid to the most vulnerable, to run hospitals, to protect civilians. But the fact that it has been so weaponized by everyone, and that you have this growing risk of famine. And the same with Sudan. I mentioned that 90% of the country is completely inaccessible. The UN can't even get around. I mean, we've had to suspend our operations there. Our staff were in hiding for several months last year. The fact that that space, not only that it's under threat and doesn't exist, but the fact that reestablishing that space isn't seen as a political priority and necessity, and there isn't international cooperation and international embarrassment and shame, that millions of people are at risk and tens of thousands of people are dying unnecessarily, that is, to me, a dramatic escalation, not only in the weaponization of aid, but an erosion of the entire Geneva Conventions, which is that we no longer have this sense that it is a duty, an obligation of parties to any conflict to provide assistance to those who are in desperate need and to prevent unnecessary loss of civilian lives. That's not even considered to be necessary at this moment, and there's no embarrassment about that. And that is the stuff that really keeps me up at night, because once that is gone, I mean, what are we? We're just fighting machines that are intent on destroying each other, and damn the consequences.
And how does that change?
Well, I think it changes one conversation at a time. It changes in our political choices that we make. I think that the only antidote to the rage-induced sort of frenzy that you had mentioned that we all seem to find ourselves in right now, where we're so intent on converting people to our side, which is never, ever, ever going to happen, because we're more locked in, we're more entrenched, we're in these echo chambers on social media. The only way that we get through that is when reasonable people behave reasonably. And I think that there is a real need right now for those of us who operate in media, who operate in the international humanitarian space, who operate in academia, to model a different way and to not subscribe to the shouting. And that's very, very hard to do. I mean, I'm flooded all the time with messages on my social media account, and I joke about it. I'm like, if I want people to tell me what's wrong with me, I got family for that. I don't need to spend time on Twitter, right? But it's, I don't know what it is, but I do know that there are more of us out there who are interested in constructive dialogue than there are on the other side.
Yeah, agree. And you certainly see this all the time with journalism as well. And the one thing I miss much about daily reporting, the one thing I don't miss is having to be out there on social media and, opening up your DMs and getting that abuse. But to your point and I fully agree, it's a small, angry minority. But to your point that there's more of us out there, and this question's to you, Carol, it almost feels like people are too scared to speak out, though. And we've had this conversation, even insofar as the work we do at CJFE. Ironically, we've been trying to hold a panel to talk about free speech, and we haven't been able to do that because there's been issues with coordinating it and making sure it doesn't turn into a shouting match or it's too political. It feels scary to speak out these days.
So, okay, I can't do this anymore because I want to interview you.
It's a little love club up here. Yeah. You get a couple journalists on the stage. It's really
Take
hard.
that hat off.
Honestly,
No?
it's
Yeah,
just-
take it off.
No.
So there's this very funny New Yorker cartoon from years ago, and it was 3 men standing around, and then one saying, so Joe, what do you think about what Mike thinks about my comment? And so I feel like, I mean,
No, you just wrote a book, though, on
I know,
in
but
terms of
yeah.
weaponization of language and what's happened to free speech. I think that really flows from what Sam's saying, that we aren't having constructive dialogue. That's really where it ends often.
Well, but in this book that you've mentioned, At a Loss for Words, what it is, it's a story of how our language of civil society has been stolen from us, weaponized, turned against us, in some case bleached of its meaning, or used as kind of language vectors to bring odious ideas into public space. And that language is always, like I mentioned, journalism is the first line of attack when someone wants to be an autocrat. But if you want to break down a society, start with its language, feed its language with anger and suspicion and the other, it's us against them. So the us against them thing is very much part of this story. And so it's the conversation in the age of rage. So demonstrating how these words have been taken, words like freedom and democracy and truth and choice. Those are 4 of the 6 I deal with. But what I deal with in the end is to say, in whose interest is this? Okay, so who is actually doing this, and because it's not just like we're deciding that we're getting angry with each other and we're on this us against them, and that we can't have civil conversations and we don't agree on what's true and all this. It's not just that it was just naturally occurring in the air. It wasn't just like pollen dust, you know. It's orchestrated. These are people who are definitely trying to undermine our relationship with each other, with our society, with our governments, and to make adversaries out of us. Because once we're adversaries, once we've broken those relationships, once we no longer agree on what is true, you break down trust. And if you lose trust, you can just do anything you want. So let's that's what I try to do in this book, is to investigate who's behind it, who's putting up the money, who's actually financing these breaks, these breaches in our society and our ability to talk to each other. And so I think this feeling of helplessness, like we want to get back to having civil conversations. We want to get back to empathy. We want to get back to all the things we feel have been lost in the past about 10 years. And we feel impotent. But the truth of the matter is that there are people working to make us feel that way. And so we have to start identifying who these players are and not allowing it to happen. And so basically, I think and so this trust deficit that we talked about at the beginning, let's just reclaim that. Let's just trust each other again. Let's talk to each other again. Let's listen to how we sound to somebody else. I think somebody said this to the students protesting against the war in Gaza, is that there are 2 sides, and so, but listen to how you sound to them, and hopefully they'll listen to how they sound to you. Start listening to how you sound and what you're saying. And so we have to start at that most fundamental level, which is just as individuals, and hopefully we can build into our communities, into our government, into our discourse, this larger level of trust, empathy, and caring. And I think that's possible, but we have to start identifying whose interest is it that we're breaking this down.
Do you think, building on that, do you think, you've both touched on this a little bit, the politics of aid and the weaponization of language and dictators shutting down free press. But in terms of the role for journalists themselves and aid workers themselves, do you think our roles have changed somewhat in terms of remaining apolitical? Definitely, I know journalism has to some degree. We have big conversations about objectivity. It never really existed. Where's that line? What do you think our roles should be going forward? Can we stay apolitical? And I'm thinking of discussions we've had. I know, Carol, we've had these, I'll start with you, about journalists bearing witness, but now being expected to be documenting war crimes and part of a prosecution. If you don't have a stance on an issue, you're not reporting it accurately. Like, those questions swirl around. Where do you think we should go? Because I think it has changed for the better to some ways, and maybe not.
There's this idea that journalism for a long time was the view from nowhere, and it didn't have a point of view. And then now it's gone completely the other way, and that you have to have a point of view. And I agree with having a point of view, but I don't think you have to have take a side in order to have a point of view. And I think this is what a lot of the young journalists are confusing. And so this idea that we're not going to be like your generation and not take a stand on things. I said, well, you can report from the point of view of human rights. What are you talking about? You know, that we can talk. We have decided on universal human rights. We have a bedrock of understanding of what we consider to be fundamental, inalienable rights of people. We can understand that is that children should not be killed in their beds, and we can understand that they should be fed, and that girls should go to school, and that people should be able to vote, and people should be able to have water and have a job and be free of want. These things are rights, and so I think that and you can report from that point of view. You can report from the point of view that there are things we have agreed upon as being absolutely fair and necessary and rightful for people. And I don't think that's a bias. I think it's an obligation. But I think that what we're now seeing increasingly in young journalists, and they are all young to me, that even the ones who think that they're old, they're young to me. But I'm hearing them saying, no, we have to if you don't take a side, then you're not being truthful, you're not being honest, and I'm coming from my point of view, and I'm thinking that's fine, but let's agree on what the point of view is, and the point of view is fundamental human rights, the rights of people to be treated with decency and respect. And if we all agree that that is what is absolutely not just not a bias, but an obligation, we can actually start recovering the trust people have in our aid organizations, our journalism, that we're all agreeing that this is wrong. And let's agree on what's wrong, and let's try and fix that. But I think that's where I think journalism has really gone off the rails, and no one knows how to answer the questions that people are asking about it.
And I think it definitely overlaps with aid.
It does, and I was going to pick up on that. I think that part of it is we've confused the presentation of information with the interpretation of that information, right? And so I genuinely believe, and I think, again, because I'm a public health doctor, I think that if you provide people with the evidence, then you don't have to necessarily politicize it or force it. People can look at that evidence and go, well, that is a really bad outcome and that shouldn't be happening. And so you don't have to necessarily hit them over the head. And I think that that's where humanitarian organizations have a very important role, because sometimes it is enough to just say, well, look, this is what's going on in Sudan, and this is why you should care. I mean, the genocide is happening again right now, and that is clear and that is documented. And we know this for Darfurians in particular. We know that it's the worst displacement crisis in the world. We know that there are atrocities that are taking place and that the needs are enormous. And so if you provide people with that information, then they can, I think, come to their own interpretation around that. The problem is that we have this unfortunate predisposition, because of the click-throughs and because of everything else, to turn that into a very activist statement, interpret it for them, and then throw it out there and expect people to respond all the time. But you can't keep tapping into that rage and sense of injustice continuously, because people just get burnt out and they become very cynical. But to go back to I think for aid organizations, you have to tread very carefully. I have personal views on certain things. As I mentioned, I'm just back from Afghanistan. I had a whole bunch of meetings with the Taliban. We definitely do not agree on anything at all. Nothing at all. But we have to be able to negotiate within that environment. And because we are a locally driven, very grassroots organization, In Afghanistan, we have over 160 staff. Almost half of them are female. They are still working, despite the edict that women cannot work. We have exemptions in place because we provide some health services through our community centers that also offer educational programming and a lot of psychological support programming for women in particular, doing incredible things. Would I like to be able to come out of Afghanistan and tell the world what I think about the Taliban? Absolutely. Do I want to make sure that our programs continue because thousands of women benefit from them and hundreds of them come into our community centers and take off their burqas and put them in the middle of the room and sit together and enjoy that moment of community that they cannot get anywhere else because of the extreme amount of repression that they're experiencing? That to me is a much more important outcome than soapboxing about what I feel is wrong with what's going on there, because if it comes at the expense of that important work, I have to be very mindful of that. So I would say that aid organizations can be small p political as opposed to big P political, because we are navigating in a very tricky space with different sides, and we ensure that it is the local staff that we have, the local civil society organizations that we're working with. Our job is to give them a platform, and they can speak in a way that they feel comfortable with, and they're the ones driving that process. Because for us to usurp that and to put them at risk, because I might have an opinion, that is not fair. Because they're the ones that are on the front lines, and they are brave, and they are courageous, and they are bold, and they are doing incredible things. And if they need us to keep them safe by walking a fine line in certain areas, then that's what we have to do. But that doesn't mean we can't feed those stories to journalists, which we do all the time.
But speaking of journalists, I want to, because I'm thinking about your work in Guantanamo Bay and your work in talking to people.
I knew she'd do this. I knew she'd do
I
She can't help but ask. She can't help but ask the questions.
Your work powder book was amazing.
But you just all the responsibility that comes with people trusting you. I mean, I'm just thinking of the incredible numbers of people who trusted you to tell you stuff that could get them into a lot of trouble. You've done that all your career, and balanced out your need to get the story out with how to protect people, how to respect them, how to get them to trust you. And you've had a lifetime of doing that, and trying to figure out what your responsibility is in the lives of others, because you have gone into, well, the film you did on the fellow who lost his leg, and you ended up doing Michelle did a documentary about how she got it wrong. I mean, it was really because she believed in him. You believed in that fellow, and in the end, you turned it into something even larger than it was. You know, I think this compassion that you have always had for people, and trying to find that place where you don't become their advocate, or you're not working for them, but just finding that place where you can be a human being in the midst of that. I don't know, how have you managed to do that?
I told you she's been reading all week. Her mind is mush. Well, I'll turn it into a discussion for us about maybe how journalism has changed for good, and in terms of some truths I think we say now in a way that's responsible journalism that we wouldn't have before. So Guantanamo is a good example. 27 trips there. After so many trips, you can't go on a tour with the Pentagon and they show you the interrogation room and they call it the reservation room. Or they call their detainees, they correct you if you say prisoner. Because if they were a prisoner, they would get a prisoner of war. All this kind of Orwellian language. And for a long time, I think at the beginning of coverage, you kind of just wrote it. You know, the Pentagon says, this says, and you kind of wrote it verbatim. And I think over the years, it was still a news article. You weren't a columnist, but once you got the experience, I think there was a greater acceptance of us being able to say, no, this is not, no, they are called detainees for this reason. I'm not going to use the Pentagon's language. And the best example I can think of this is Daniel Dale, who was at the Toronto Star, who we lost to CNN. But he was the original one who started the Donald Trump fact checker, and I can't remember the name we had at the start.
Fact Find.
What was it?
I thought it was fact find or find fact. Because you know I do, because I had to, today in the audiobook, I had to actually say Daniel Dale's CNN thing, fact find. I went out to do it, I had to back up and run over about 5 times before I got it right, so it's in my mind.
But that was and that actually started the Toronto Star and then later spread to New York Times and others, where suddenly you would say, and Trump lied today. Or Trump, and you wouldn't print what was said verbatim. You were doing fact checking in the process of reporting. And that really builds trust, I think. So back to you, and then also to Sam, how the aid industry has changed for the good, because I do have in here now to the good questions. I didn't want to leave you all on a very depressed tone. So we're going to talk about some of the good. But how has it changed for the better? Like where is it getting better? We've talked a lot about, there's one example, but we've also talked a lot about the empowering of local journalists as well. We are hearing from voices we never would have heard of 15 years ago. We're 3 white ladies sitting on this this stage, which is better than what it used to be of 3 white guys, but it's also
progress.
but it's also a rarity today, which is great. It's a much more diverse field. We're hearing from people we never would have. So just talk a little bit about the good.
It's so fragile, though. I was for World Press Freedom Day. There's an Afghan organization, Afghan journalist organization here in Toronto, and they invited me to come out and join them, and it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary room full of high-end journalists. There were about, 100 journalists just in Toronto from Afghanistan who should be in Afghanistan covering things. And I said that to them when I spoke. I said, I'm not happy to see you. I'm really sorry to see you here. I'm really sorry we're together tonight, because you shouldn't be here. You should be in your own country. But it was in a very short period of time, because of international assistance, and there was a fair bit of it, that just was like watering a soil that looks like it doesn't have anything in it, and it starts to sprout. And so it was really, in Afghanistan, really done right, for one of the few things they got right in the years of the occupation and war. What they managed to do is to just allow so many of these news agencies to spring up. And they were doing great stuff. And it wasn't us. It's in the olden days that we used to call it file folder journalism. And we would be, something was going on in the world, and we would be dispatched to cover it. And you'd read, okay, where is this country again? And you're reading this on the plane, and you get there, and you're reporting on it. And it was bullshit, to be doing that. And so increasingly, and we couldn't do it. We get on the ground and we look for the local journalists who we paid some measly amount of money, who would help us to navigate and tell the story. And somebody think, this is insane. Why aren't you telling the story? Why am I telling your story? But now increasingly you see that ferment. There's just so much energy. There's so much desire for people to tell their own stories, and they do a better job than we do because they're their own stories. But to see how Afghanistan, with a little bit of effort, a little bit of support from the outside, was able to develop this robust journalistic tradition within a period of a decade. It was just so exciting, and then just so absolutely depressing to be in the room with all these high. And they showed video clips and everything of their work, and then they had a video, their scroll of people who just died in the past couple of years. All the journalists who've been killed there, the ones who escaped and the ones who stayed. It's just. But I guess I'm supposed to be the hopeful part, right? So,
we're waiting for it.
Okay, I'm working on it. I'm a journalist, for God's sake.
I'll give Sam the hopeful question.
Go, Rick. It's all yours.
No, did you have a hopeful part?
I do. I will think of a hopeful part.
Okay.
Speak amongst yourselves.
She'll work on hope. Sam, War Child's always had that model of local organizations, and I think you said in one of our calls prior, I hope we're not around in another 25 years from now. We don't need this outside help. So what are you seeing that is hopeful?
I am very privileged to be on the front lines of that progress and that hopefulness literally every single day. It's absolutely astonishing. And I see that progress in the 900 staff that we have who come from war-torn countries. Our country director, Alfred Okech in Uganda. Uganda is the largest refugee hosting country in Africa. It's one of our biggest programs where we do catch-up learning for kids who have been out of school for many years as a result of war and displacement, and then they get to catch up. They do 2 years over 1 year. We also offer some skills training that are tied to market needs, and they can have their own business development and their own small business loans, and they start earning an income. And one of the things that really motivates Alfred is that he survived the Lord's Resistance Army. He was out of school for 4 years, and so he knows what it's like to be a kid who just didn't have that kind of opportunity. And now he's in one of the most senior positions within our organization, but he started as an education manager in Sudan, where he had been working, and then went back to Uganda, which is where he's from, with his family. And so seeing that progress and that work and that level of commitment that is coming from within war-torn communities, but people who have faced tremendous adversity and who are so deeply invested because they see themselves in those kids is astonishing. And we see that as well with our country director, Emmanuel, in South Sudan. I mean, when I was at the Darfurian border with him just a few months ago, and we were meeting some of the Darfurian refugees who were coming across, women and girls, and they were in absolutely desperate, destitute situations. And when we drove into this one mosque that had been bombed and burned, and the Darfurian refugees didn't want to go to the regular designated refugee camps because they were being targeted and the girls were being assaulted, and so they had set up this makeshift center, and they had been cut off from any supplies because they were basically being forced to go back. And so we pulled in with our team. And one of the young girls who approached us mentioned that she'd been in our education programming in Darfur, our catch-up learning, and she'd gone on to then, she was in medical school, and she was just a few weeks from graduation. She had finished her final exams. And one of the things she said to myself and to Emmanuel was, she said, "I know, War Child, you were there for 20 years. I know your team. I know, that they have faced tremendous adversity as a result of this, but I knew you would not forget us. I knew you would come." And Emmanuel started bawling. I mean, everybody was bawling. And he says to me in the car, he said, "I was a returnee. I'm from South Sudan. I was in Khartoum when the war started. I was in government. I was in student government. I was almost finished my school. I was on the verge of graduating when Omar al-Bashir came into power, and they started arresting all of the students who were part of the student government because they felt that they were all dissidents. He ended up escaping. He went back across the border as a returnee to South Sudan. He was in one of those refugee camps that these girls were afraid of going into, these returnee camps as well. And he would explain to me that he would run every day. It was 25 kilometers there and back, so it was about 16 kilometers each direction, 15 kilometers each direction. My math is a bit off. I've been having some wine. 12 and a half kilometers in each direction. And he would do that to go to the library so that he could continue his education, and because they had free juice and cookies, and that was the only way he could eat. And so then we came back and we're trying to figure out, how we were going to provide support to these refugees and advocate on their behalf with UNHCR. But that, to me, when you see the opportunities that get created and the level of commitment and investment, because people see themselves in that generation and they want a different outcome, and they know how important those small gestures are, those large gestures, that is incredibly hopeful. And it's incredibly hopeful to be in Afghanistan with our female staff who, frankly, have not known from 1 month to the next whether we were going to get shut down, because we're still waiting for the minister to sign the MOU that allows us to have our health exemption. But you see the women coming together, and you see them still learning, still striving, and it's a major setback, but seeing that kind of subversive, passionate resistance, and then being in a room with our female staff, and they
take off their burqas and they're putting on their makeup and they're posing for selfies and they have the best filters I've ever seen in my entire life. And I'm thinking, how did you even know how to do this? You know, to me, you just have to find those amazing people everywhere, right? Here in Toronto, in Canada, in the world, and when you empower them, when you create space for them, when you invest in them, they are a passionate, compelling alternative to those forces that we feel we will never be able to control or change, right? And hopefully, my belief is that in 25 years, one of the reasons why we will maybe not exist is because maybe a guy like Alfred or someone like Emmanuel or those amazing women in Afghanistan, maybe they'll be president, maybe they'll be prime minister, maybe they'll be the head of the UN. And I live my life believing that because I think that otherwise we're doomed.
Well, that was the hopeful part, wasn't it? Okay.
I was going to ask her.
I have hope.
The bar on hope is very low now.
Okay, no, I'm going for it. No, actually, I mean, what gave me hope, something gave me hope last week. 12 people.
Did you write it down? Was it just
I wrote it down, it's in my head. 12 people whose names we don't know, we may never know. 12 people who were in a courtroom in New York. 12 people who didn't do anything because they were extraordinary. They weren't extraordinary. They were just ordinary, 12 ordinary people. They didn't do anything as far as we know, and probably it's the case, nothing out of malice, nothing out of anger. They just did something that they did something in a situation where they believed it. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed this is what you do. And we know that they convicted Donald Trump. And not just that man, but an organization, MAGA, which is threatening to kill anyone who opposes Donald Trump and what they're about. And yet 12 people sat in a room, listened to the evidence, and made a choice, made a decision in the midst of a system that they believed in. They had faith in it. And we know from having been in many parts of the world where there's no way that would have happened. Because they would have been intimidated. They would have just known that you can't do that. You can't get away with this. You'll be dead before you get to the end of the street. And so that doesn't happen. Increasingly, it doesn't happen in many parts of the world. But it happened in New York last week. It happened in New York that a group of people decided, they just believed that we can do this. This is what we're supposed to do. And that gave me tremendous hope that we can get back to this. We can own this again, right? And I think that they weren't extraordinary, but they did have courage. They had courage to do it. And I think that's what's missing in so many things, and why I think both Michelle and I are at CJFE, because it's an organization with a lot of courage. It stands up to the bad guys. It speaks truth to power. It says, no, we're not going to keep our heads below the ramparts. And aren't we seeing that? We're seeing that so much. Even with our politicians. I just think, just put your head up. I know you might get shot down, but just look up and get a long view and start to have some vision, start to have some courage, start to have some direction. And I think that once we get this feeling that, we're not defeated here. They're not winning. And we have the courage to stand up and say, we're going to do the right thing here because we're not going to let this go. It's too good. So that gave me hope. How's that?
That was very good. That was very hopeful.
I don't think Hallmark is going to hire either of you for messages of hope, but I think it's a wonderful place to end tonight on. And I just want to thank you both so much for a brilliant discussion.
Thank you.
Then thank myself. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And as I mentioned, our guests will be around after if you'd like to stay and mingle. And I think we have the space for a little while anyway. We won't get kicked out for
Oh, yeah.
at least a half an hour.
I'll be at the bar till 10.
Oh, there you go. We've been told she closes the bar, actually.
I always close the bar.
That was actually what we were told.
But I think for anybody who, well, you want to see all this again, probably not. But if you have people who wanted to be here tonight, this video is going to be posted both on War Child's website and on Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. Get those CJFE. Okay, that's our initials. But so we hope lots of other people engage with this conversation tonight and with our organizations. And so, but it's really great to see you people here. Thank you.
It is. Thank you for being here. And I would just add to that there's this assumption that that NGOs don't work together and that we're intensely competitive. And I hope that you leave this. There's a piece of hope. Recognizing that one of the reasons why we're here doing this together is that we understand that we're all part of a continuum, and that all the work that is being presented here this evening is important. And if you have questions for any of us and you want to know more about what we do, I have huge respect for both of you, but also CJFE is a terrific organization. And so anybody here this evening, I certainly hope that you'll consider supporting. And I will add as well, one of the things we talked about at the very, very beginning is, how can we foster different outcomes and not be so subjected to the kind of ups and downs of the press cycle. And you mentioned that advocacy isn't something that's necessarily well-funded. We work in a lot of places that are not necessarily well-funded. This is my pitch for you are, in terms of your impact, you're much better off giving an amount of money on a regular basis to an organization that you truly believe in and trusting them to do the great work that they do with that financial support than seeing a crisis in the news and writing a check and walking away and wondering why things don't ever seem to be any better. When we can create this kind of community and have a relationship with our donors and our supporters, any kind of humanitarian organization or charity, it gives us the flexibility and it gives us the opportunity to really have an impact and to direct those resources where we understand from our experience and our knowledge and our context on the ground where it's needed the most. So that's true for any cause, including the ones that are represented here today. So thank you for being here, and I'll see you at the bar.
At the bar.
And thank you to both of you.
Okay.